Welcome to Generations in the News. Today I'll be talking about some articles related to the silent generation. Now, the silent generation probably had the least amount of articles of any of the generations when I was looking. We often talk about how Gen X gets skipped over, but how often do you hear about the silent generation? There are active members from this generation, and we do talk about individual members sometimes. It's more that you just don't hear about the generation as a whole. Some of the articles I saw were referencing just about what is the generation, but I already have a whole video about that if you want to check that out. Let's get into their current coverage though. Perhaps the only topic I saw coming up multiple times was the Great Wealth Transfer. If you're not familiar with what that is, it basically has to do with the wealth of older generations potentially transferring to younger generations. An article on the website planadvisor.com reported that while we are talking about this transfer going from baby boomers to millennials, the upcoming decade is going to see more going from the silent generation to Generation X. This article by Natalie Lynn was reporting on information from the research firm Hearts and Wallets, which conducted a survey in 2023. It seems others got the memo, though, as a Forbes article by Joseph Coughlin described the Great Wealth Transfer as a handoff between the silents and boomers to Gen X, millennials, and Gen Z over the next decades. The author says it is considered the greatest transfer of wealth in history, which is probably why we've named it the Great Wealth Transfer. This particular article, which is really about all the generations, wanted to talk about how this transfer is not always happening in the way you might think, though. Although the idea has to do with older adults passing and then the wealth transferring, and that is a large part of it, aspects of this transfer can happen while everyone is still alive. Although it was not given as an example, one way this could manifest is down payment assistance with a home or something along those lines. Coughlin's focus in the article, however, was on multi-generational travel as a form of wealth transfer. For some, it can be a good way to bond and make memories together. Sometimes this includes multiple generations, while other times it can include grandparents and grandkids, a trend called skip-gen traveling. I found this really interesting. Comment below if you've experienced this or if you've heard about this. Now, I had a hard time pulling other themes out of articles, so I thought I would just cover a few more articles written by silents about silence. I did find it interesting that a couple of them focused on college when going to college was not really the norm at the time. But my thought is maybe that those people who did go to college are the ones who grew up to become journalists and are still journalists today. What they did say was news to me, though. The first article is from a silent generation woman named Janet Silvergant. She talks about the transition silent generation women went through, where they were living in this very traditional environment, and then suddenly in the 60s and 70s, it was a very different time for women. And a lot of women went through changes at this time, herself included. She describes the 1950s and 60s as the feminine mystique of the housewifely, which was followed by the I am woman, I can do and be anything mystique of the post-liberation era. For Ghent, neither quite felt like a fit. She reported that women at the time were encouraged to marry young. The average age for marriage in 1960, when she went to college, was a little over the age of 20. She herself married for the first time at age 22. At the same time, some women were advised to pursue a career to fall back on. Sounds like it was the case in her family. Usually something that was more historically female-dominated, such as nursing, teaching, or librarianship. An acronym Ghent used, which I wasn't familiar with, was the PHT degree, which stands for Putting Hubby Through. Growing up, my silent generation grandma actually did go to college, and she mentioned a different acronym, the MRS, which is what she got instead of a degree, but I had not heard of the PHT before. So I looked into it, and some women were actually given an official PHT or good wife diploma. The term used depended on the university or college when their husband graduated. This was for their help and support and being a good wife while their husband completed college. For Ghent, when applying to jobs in college, she also had to put student wife on her resume. Additionally, she said people at interviews could ask if she had plans for a family. Ghent also mentioned another acronym I had not heard of, which was IBM for I've Been Moved. The next article I have featuring college students was written by a man named Dean Norman. The article is titled The Silent Generation and Panty Raids. There apparently is an episode of SpongeBob on this, but the episode was later removed due to being inappropriate. Anyway, it turned out it does indeed have to do with panties. First, the article starts off with a little bit about some context for the silent generation's name and a bit about the 1950s. The author, Dean Norman, notes that we were in a Cold War with Russia and a hot war with North Korea and China, and as college students, we laughed at politicians, but we just hoped the Korean War would stop while we had our college deferments. Then when we graduated, we could get good jobs, get married, and live happily ever after, noting a contrast with the activist students of the 20s and 30s. I'm sure there was some variation, though. Anyway, Norman goes on to talk about how these so-called Panty Raids were happening at colleges across the U.S. They involved college men gathering around women's dormitories and sororities, and the women giving them panties. Allegedly, the women would wave panties out the window as well. He said the men would sometimes go as far as to break windows to get these panties, which obviously sounds concerning. I decided to look into it more. It seems panty raids were indeed a prank that went on between the 40s and 60s. The first documented instance involved some men entering a women's building through heated tunnels under the building, then unlocking the doors for the rest of the men, which totaled over 100, to enter, locking the house mother in her apartment and cutting the light and phone lines. All in all, they only took panties from a few women because I guess the goal was just to cause a commotion, but it sounds like it would be pretty scary. News got around and this spread to other universities. In some cases, women were more on board with the idea than others. This does sound somewhat in contrast with the experience of Ghent, but it is possible that these experiences still coexisted at the same universities, but it also just shows the diversity of experience across one generation, even within this area of college. I will note that the author said they did not participate in these raids. And then the final article focuses on a little bit more wholesome entertainment. This one is by someone named Mike Tussey. He says he was in elementary school during World War II, and kids grew up quickly during this time. He mentioned this was a time before junior league football, but Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts were still around. Bicycles were both enjoyed and sought after. The author's two prized possessions were his bike, which he reported cost $5, and his baseball bat, but unfortunately, no teams to play for. Movies were a great form of entertainment, though. Tussey said in the 40s and 50s, kids would commonly go to the Saturday matinee. They would run free, enjoying a 15-cent movie ticket and 5-cent candy bars. The matinee ticket would give them cartoons, previews, movie news, and a double feature. The movies were such a big part of life, and Tussey can even recall his favorites from different years. Another popular activity was gathering around the radio, which then transitioned to TV when TVs became more popular. And then when the transistor radio came out, that gave them a bit more mobility, so people could listen to the radio anywhere, giving them a sense of freedom. Today's version might be wireless earbuds or headphones. Tussey didn't mention this, which is surprising because he said he was a DJ as a young man and still is today. Some of these silents really find ways to stay active. So what do you think about these articles about the silent generation? Comment below if you learned anything or if anything surprised you, and I will see you next time.